in the process of designing and you're adding new features and stuff like that, it's just easy to just add more things. When you see the evolution to get there, you kind of empathize for how we ended up there. But if you don't see the evolution, you're coming fresh at a screenshot with no context. You're like, what is that? And when someone has to explain to be like, okay, let me just unpack this, like what's going on for you. To me, that's an indication of like, well, maybe we haven't made it simple enough, or maybe we haven't kind of like really distilled the value proposition enough. And the best product managers are able to add more power while maintaining like that feeling of simplicity. That's the same idea with the screenshot test too, of like, what is the one screenshot that is completely self-explanatory? You look at it and you're like, I want that.
Welcome to In Depth, a show that surfaces tactical advice founders and startup leaders need to grow their teams, companies, and themselves. I'm Brett Burson, a partner at First Round, and we're a venture capital firm that helps startups like Notion, Roblox, Uber, and Square tackle company building firsts. On the In-Depth podcast, we share weekly conversations with startup leaders that skip the talking points and go deeper into not just what to do, but how to do it. Learn more and subscribe today at firstround.com. Today, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Yuhki Yamashita. Yuhki joined Figma around the 90 employee mark after using the product at Uber, which was one of Figma's first large customers. He wasn't even necessarily convinced that Figma would turn into a juggernaut, but he has seen up close just how magical the tool was and wanted to be a part of it. Prior to Figma, Yuhki had done tours of duty at some of the most influential companies around: Microsoft, YouTube, and Uber. Early in our conversation, we talk about these different chapters of building product, from Microsoft's relentless attention to detail to the importance of storytelling at YouTube and Uber's depth of understanding of the problem. And that brings us to Figma's product philosophy. We discuss Figma's approach to multi-product, which has been quite measured and some might say cautious. How do they land on a decision to launch a new product? And what's his advice to other product leaders navigating these waters? We also spend a lot of time talking about storytelling and how this has shaped Figma from the earliest days of launching within an existing category to now layering on new products. How do you tell a compelling story when building a design tool where 2/3 of the users aren't designers? Here, Yuhki explains his one screenshot test for figuring out if a product story is coherent enough, along with other pieces of advice for PMs looking to shape up their storytelling chops. Thanks for tuning in, and now my conversation with Yuhki. Maybe one place to start is, what is your theory as to why Figma worked? Like your current theory that may be imperfect given how random and complex companies are.
Obviously, I think the first thing was just a bet on this technology web that was a bit speculative back in the day. And no one could imagine a professional tool as complex as Figma in the browser. But if it could be achieved, it would be something that would be amazing from the perspective of what it opens up, because all of a sudden, every design file becomes a URL, not something that you have to download an application for. So that bet that Evan and Dylan took on the technology was probably the first thing that, people didn't necessarily believe that we could get to that level of fidelity or performance in the browser. The second and maybe less obvious thing is how Dylan went around and really got the influencers on board, people in the community whose voice mattered, whose voice people listened to. And so he actually visualized design Twitter into this graph and figured out the nodes that were the largest of, okay, who's following who, and then went to them and showed Figma, got their feedback, kept going back to them, not trying to sell them it, but just show them Figma and get them excited and kind of loyal because it's kind of coming back and responding to their feedback. And over time, making them want to talk about Figma. And I think an important component of that was that he was supplying them with like an idea that was kind of controversial. Every good narrative has a little bit of tension. And the tension was this idea that everyone could be in the file at the same time. And that was now intuitive, but back then was considered undesirable to some extent. Like, this idea that a hovering art director is always going to be in your file, like your product manager, your CEO is going to be able to see every movement you're making, was not something that was necessarily welcomed. But it also had a view about design and what it should be that was more progressive. And so that kind of balance of like, standing for something of like what design should be, while also having a little bit of controversy, kind of supplied a narrative that a lot of these influencers or, evangelists were excited to talk about and spread.
On the first point, which was about the enabling technology, how much do you think was just luck and patience versus a deep understanding and belief that sort of we're on the precipice that's going to allow something to happen that couldn't have happened 5 or 10 years before?
I mean, I think realistically both. I wasn't there when it happened, so you're going to have to bring Dylan and Evan on to really kind of grill them on that. But, one of the things I remember was Evan was just famous for pushing the bounds of WebGL. Like he had this website that showed these amazing graphics. And we actually have a table inside our Figma office that commemorates this, but he basically has these balls inside a water pool that's really dynamic and you can play with, that looks photorealistic. And he loved playing with WebGL in that way. And so he was really pushing the bounds of it. So I think he saw it in a way that a lot of other people didn't. But of course, there's some luck as well as, browser technologies kind of evolved in accordance.
At what point in the company's life did you end up joining?
So I joined when we were about 90 people or so. I actually had joined because I was at Uber before, and at Uber, we were one of the first large companies to experimentally use Figma, and I happened to be on the team that brought it on. It wasn't my idea as our designers, but I definitely saw its transformation on how we worked, but it was still at a time when not everybody was all in on it. It wasn't obvious that there was going to be one tool for a given company. There's a lot of fragmentation at the time.
So what did you see in it in that early form that made you want to bet your career on it?
Well, I was someone who bounced back and forth between product management and design, and kind of I had a worldview that these functions the boundary between them should be more blurred. And, I remember some of my early PM days where design mocks were maybe in Photoshop files or sketch files, and that maybe files I didn't have access to, or I didn't have access to Sketch and couldn't open them. And so I would take these PNGs that, designers had created and then take them back to Photoshop to edit it in the way I wanted. And it was just such a roundabout process. And Figma completely changed that. If I needed to put together a product review and I'm putting together a flow and needed to make some adjustments, to make it make sense, I could do that myself for the first time. And that just made so much sense to me. And I think that worldview that design shouldn't be something that only designers do was something that resonated with me a lot as well.
So even before you started to use the early version of Figma, you sort of had this feeling that product and design should sort of sit together more closely, or sort of have workflows that were less sort of arduous. The product sort of fit the own vision that you had in your head?
I would say so.
Was it an easy decision to leave and go there? Because I think this was long before it was obviously such a spectacular company.
I mean, honestly, I went to Figma not because I thought it'd be a big business, but rather because they were building a magical tool that I loved. And, I always kind of take the perspective of, well, if I get to be part of a company to make a tool that I love and have more people love, that's like, I'm happy about that. And it just so happened to be a good business. So I remember seeing some of like the ARR numbers and trying to make sense of it. But really, it was just like my own conviction in the product. And then also, I really love the design community. And this is really about making jobs like mine better and helping teams build products, design products much more efficiently. So I think I could get behind that mission.
What has building products across many different companies taught you about building product? And in the sense of Figma and Uber, Microsoft, Google, all, I assume, build products differently, are all known for great products in sort of different contexts.
It's interesting because, I think about all the different chapters of my life of different kinds of ways of building product. Like, for example, at Microsoft, I started and it was very much about the super detailed spec, where if you were the PM, you could be the PM just on Control Z or, undo feature of Excel or something. And you would kind of have to think about all the different edge cases and how they would work and document it really well. And, it would have we would even have a process which we called a design change request, a DCR, which was when you realized that your spec was wrong and you actually had to go through a formal process to get it amended, because it was already in development phase. And obviously, I'm sure Microsoft has since changed its ways and, it's an artifact of kind of more boxed software. Right. But, nonetheless, it was a culture of extreme attention to detail, which has stayed with me for forever. And then on the other hand, when I went to, for example, Google or even Uber, the area of what you're responsible was so much bigger. And so you had to really invest in kind of like the team understanding the problem so that they can make their own local decisions well, because you couldn't possibly make all those decisions. And so, investing a lot in storytelling, like how do you actually get people rallied around the problem and like deeply understand it so they can make the right call in a world where you can't even audit everything. And, going all the way to Figma now, it's like the tool itself enables that. It's a much more fluid process because everyone can be in the file, keep updating it, and you keep updating the designs. Everything is kind of always a work in progress, including the product itself. And so, those are kind of these distinct chapters in different ways of working. And the only thing I can really take away from it is like, there's no one way to build products. And in fact, it's really messy and nonlinear. We like to distill this process of building products into these like distinct stages, with really clean kind of moments in time when there's clarity and you're kind of handing off. But the reality is it has to be so much more fluid than that. And today we live in a world where you can update the product like within seconds. And so, when you kind of take that worldview, everything is live. You kind of have to adjust your way of working accordingly.
In the context of building products, like how do you think about what is correct? Are there primitives that work across companies?
I think that, at the end of the day, what you're judged by is whether you've solved the problem at hand, right? Whether you've solved the problem for the user, whether you've solved the problem for the business. And that's what we're all trying to do in terms of building a product or, designing a product. Figma and Uber work in very different ways in terms of building products. Uber was very much about, you can be a little bit more fast and loose, get stuff out there, learn. And to your point, ops was really important, to the point where sometimes operational changes could have a drastically bigger impact on the business, on the user, on the driver rider than the product itself. And, that's kind of a humbling thing to understand as someone who's always been in digital products, right? On the other hand, with Figma, yes, we love to move fast, but at the same time, if we just kind of start introducing new features left and right, it confuses people, right? And you kind of end up proliferating all these objects and primitives that you'll have to support forever. So you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about that. So, like those two companies, I think, rightfully so, behave differently in terms of like how we design and how we build products. But at the end of the day, there is kind of a goal that we're going for. And Uber is about getting as many trips done, whatever it takes to get there. And then, with Figma, it's about, how do we actually help teams design and build products, the best products possible, as efficiently as possible, or whatever we can do to do that. And that's why people use Figma and pay for Figma. And so it's really about understanding that goal and optimizing around it.
In the context of Figma, what are the indications that you use maybe over the course of the trajectory of the company's life that you want to change some structure or do something different?
The examples I think of right now are, as we've embarked on the journey of becoming a multi-product company, with building FigJam and slides and dev mode and more things coming, that has meant really changing the way we work in a significant way. Because, while it's true that Figma has always been a product where it's not just designers that show up, there's a lot of non-designers who show up to the platform too. In fact, 2/3 of our weekly active users are non-designers. These products that we've built have started to, really widen the aperture and try to really optimize for different audiences. And as part of that, the way we work, we know how to talk to designers, but when we need to figure out how to, meet the needs of the entire product team, we actually have to change the way we work, starting from who we go and talk to and how we communicate with them. So that was really obvious to us. Or I think another thing has been, and recently challenges that we've had is, we have a very integrated product platform where every new product we build is built on the same platform and relates to each other in a really tight way. And that's what's caused us to build something that's differentiated, but it's also created a lot more complexity. And as you build these new products, like you want to enable them to move fast, but also whatever they do changes the entire system or can impact other products too. And so we're now thinking about how we change the way we work to recognize that.
So sort of on this thread of going multi-product, before you started to do that, did you sort of get together as a team and say, we're going to do something new, and what ways do we need to change to do this? Or did you start doing it and you unearthed that we're in a new paradigm and we have to sort of rethink some of our previous assumptions?
I would love to have had that foresight, but, we just kind of dove right in. And, with FigJam, for example, which is our whiteboarding product, I kind of remember we were in the height of the pandemic, and it was really like people were using Figma design as a whiteboard, as a brainstorm tool, just because it was the pandemic, it was remote work. And, we're sick of Zoom happy hours. So they started hanging out in Figma instead, and we're like, okay, we should capitalize on this because, whenever your users are hacking your product in a fun way, that's really great inspiration for there's a need here. And we kind of dove right in and, started building out a product. And in that process, started realizing a bit like, should we just let this team be completely independent and do whatever they want and just let them move as fast as possible? Or, should we think about how these things are related so that, you're kind of building for the greater good, but maybe kind of slowing down just the whiteboard tool development, right? When we think about the competitive dynamics, it's a hard question to answer because there's a lot of great players out there. And we're trying to, like, at that time, play catch up. And so speed seemed of the essence. But the more we create divergence, like later it becomes very difficult to unify, especially in a world where we believe that should be some fluidity between the tools that we build. So yeah, there are debates like that emerge. And now, like as we build our third and fourth and, many more products to come, I think we have a little bit more of like a framework of, okay, like maybe there are some common things, or we should maybe have a different way of organizing. So there's a team that's thinking about kind of these shared primitives right out of the gate, or we should maybe think about our go-to-market motion differently, or how we incentivize sales differently from the very beginning. So those are learnings we're very much applying. But back then, we're just kind of winging it in a way. Yeah.
How does the needs of your business fit into the way that you think about product expansion? A lot of people start by saying, okay, well, we build a second product, we're likely going to try to sell another SKU into the same end buyer. It's like one way of thinking about it. Other people are like, we want to sell a similar SKU and get a new end buyer. So that's like Jira going from selling to VP of Eng to security. And in one way, you can be rooted in the problem of the customer. But the other is you could think about what you're trying to do as a business, which might be, right now our product is mainly used by product managers and designers. A business goal of ours is to create a reason for business users to have an account or non-designers to have an account. Like, how does all of that fit together to the way that you think about building future products?
We're in a fortunate position where, both the user needs and our business needs are somewhat aligned in that, when you look at the landscape of product development, like we think end to end about the product development process. Like a lot of people see Figma as a design tool where you draw some mocks and build some prototypes, but we know that that's not the end goal. Like that is in service of this broader goal, which is to actually get a product built. And so insofar as that's true, we've actually always been thinking about the end-to-end process. Like some of the reasons that we bring, primitives or abstractions that are inspired by code into design is because that is a thing that helps translate those designs into code later. So we've always been thinking about kind of the end-to-end, and it's actually becoming a much more fluid process now where the going from an idea all the way to a final product has become much more compressed in recent times. And that's because, the design process is faster. And with design systems, it's because of AI. It's because of kind of like stronger relationships between design and code. So, all of that is happening. And so it's actually imperative for us to think about kind of the needs of an engineer even more, for example. So that's kind of where, the landscape of product development is going, where design isn't just a step, it's actually kind of part of the entire process to some extent. From a business need perspective, we have, as I mentioned, 2/3 of our users our weekly active users are non-designers, like developers, like PMs and others. And, they are in our product and very engaged.
Has that ratio been the same for years and years?
It has, yeah. And, they're in the product because they need to see the designs first and foremost. And then we've started to think about, well, how can we add way more value for developers? We started building dev mode, which allows them to have a custom environment just for developers that makes it really easy for them to understand the designs, or in some cases, connect the designs to the code base in interesting ways. And as part of doing that, have compelled them to buy dev mode. We kind of expand that way. And same thing with product managers and others where, they're doing a lot of jobs that surround Figma today. And there's a lot of inconveniences around it. So if we can solve it, then we can actually, expand to those functions as well. And that's a huge opportunity for us. So I think both defense and offense aligned in that way.
What about when you zoom out now that you've shipped your first few standalone products after kind of the core Figma product? What are some of the most important things that you figured out that if you were talking to another product leader or CEO who has a single product company right now that's doing very well and is thinking about their next set of products? Like, are there big ideas that you've kind of worked through now over multiple years that would be useful for them to know?
I think about, for example, dev mode, which is kind of a product that we started selling this year, at the beginning of this year. And I would say internally, it wasn't always clear to us that this is something that we had to do, or I think that we had kind of an intuition that developers were struggling inside the Figma product and we could do better for them. But we didn't really know necessarily that productizing something for them is going to kind of have a really strong impact. So there's a lot of debate about that, whether it's worth it. And it turned out as soon as we launched, it was very clear that people needed it and wanted it and people were buying it. And so it's one of those things where we could have been a little bit less precious. I think there's this idea of, the gravity of a second product or a third product, and as a result of that, kind of wanting to be a little bit more thoughtful before putting it out in the world. And I kind of feel like we could have been a little bit more experimental about it to test out the waters, and not feel like pressure that, oh, this is our second or third product and therefore it has to be a certain way. I think the other ones are, I think the best products come out of a little bit of internal conflict around people standing up for a use case in a way that is counterintuitive to the core product team. The core product team is so used to one way of thinking and a set of users and has built years of intuition. And it can be hard to suddenly take on the user needs of some totally different persona. And so I think it's been successful when we've put leaders on these other new efforts that just bring in a completely new perspective and can challenge all the assumptions around the core product, right? So as an example, maybe you look at our core product and you're like, well, of course, every new product we have to have has to be an infinite canvas. And, that's just table stakes at Figma, right? But then it turns out, developers find it really hard to navigate that. And, someone who can advocate for a perspective like that and challenge some core assumptions like that, I think is really critical. And through that debate, you kind of build the best product. So I would say, yeah, you really need to create an environment where, people can really feel ownership of their new audience without feeling the burden of legacy in a way.
How do you do that?
I think it's bringing in people who are kind of singularly passionate about the new audience that you're going after or the new use case. For developer efforts, our engineering leader was someone who we came through an acqui-hire of, a team really thinking about kind of how to translate design into code. And so they built their own tool because they didn't think that Figma was doing enough, right? And so there already was this perception from them, okay, Figma as it stands is not doing enough here. So they brought in a kind of outsider's perspective, which is really healthy, I thought.
Do you think there's a difference between a great PM that maybe works on a portion of the core product versus a great PM in the context of creating a net new product?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I would say that like I'm more of the latter. Like I've always worked on core experiences, whether it was at YouTube or Uber or, even, initially at Figma, it was about like, how do you take this thing that's mostly working and then scale it and add more to it and make it more powerful. And that's like a skill set that's really thinking about kind of like, how do you extend the current system? How do you do it in a way that doesn't, risk the current business? And a lot of it is also just about like internal convincing people of the importance of a change that, might seem disruptive, right? In a world where it's easy to just fall into the innovator's dilemma. And so that's one skill set, I would say. And then taking something from 0 to 1 is like, being much more scrappy, being willing to take, risks because you don't even have users, really valuing speed and, questioning some core assumptions as we talked about, in the current product. And yeah, I think it takes a different kind of like persistence and bullishness and, and I'm not saying that one person can't do both, but you kind of have to exhibit very different behaviors, I think, because starting from 0 is very different from starting from an existing system. They're both hard, but the techniques are so different.
And so when you're now getting a new product off the ground, does it start with who has those sensibilities that you want to put on it as like the first place it begins?
Yeah, I mean, I think, at Figma, we often talk about, starters, like people who are really great at getting something off the ground. And, people who can come up with that kind of core idea that, you can latch onto that seems really interesting. So whether that's in engineering or design or PM, like we definitely look for that kind of skill set.
And do you mostly try to take existing people at the company and find somebody with those sensibility and put them on it? Or do you like to have somebody come in from the outside?
We've done both. Obviously, it's hard to always just be bringing in new people every time you come up with an idea. So we definitely have folks who are really good at taking something, from scratch or, creating something more experimental. But sometimes like this comes a little bit more bottoms up. So for example, we have this thing we call Maker Week, which is kind of like a hack week where people are making things, everything from, things in software to just like physical things to, to express themselves. But I think it's part of that. People are often pitching new products and you kind of see who emerges as like particularly entrepreneurial. And it's kind of a forum that kind of allows you to be experimental with these types of prototypes.
What does it look like to you if you are experiencing someone as particularly entrepreneurial?
Entrepreneurs are slightly irrational, right? By taking something from nothing and bringing it into existence, you're doing something that people didn't really believe was possible. And so there's a lot more like brute force, or there's a lot more kind of like selling the team on this, and products don't emerge from just like rational line of thinking sometimes, or there needs to be a spark somewhere. And there are these people who know when they really need to dial it up and hustle, to get something from, not believable to believable. So yeah, I think some of those things, attributes, the passion, the scrappiness, a little bit of irrationality, I think those are attributes, I would say.
In terms of your own experience, that people kind of either have it, like that it's in them or not, or do you see people kind of develop those sensibilities over time?
I think it's always possible to develop these things. I wouldn't see it necessarily always as like you have it or you don't. Like you may have it for a certain class of ideas, or, there are people who are passionate about like certain things and like believe that the world should be one way, not the other. But they don't always have to think about it for every topic out there in the universe, right? And so I think that you can be entrepreneurial in different areas, because of your unique points of view.
Why do you think there haven't been more mega successful companies of the last decade in Silicon Valley that were started by designers? It feels like there was a time in 2010, 2012, maybe when Brian Chesky was getting Airbnb off the ground, where it felt like there was a opportunity for a groundswell of more designers to build wonderful companies. And there's obviously examples of this, but it feels like it's an underexpressed founder archetype.
Part of it, I think, is actually that these functions have also become more fluid. Maybe back then in the Brian Chesky days, like, the division of labor between all these functions is very clear. And now there are a lot of founders who are not designers, but who kind of have more design sensibilities, or who know what good looks like and who have these higher standards, or who can do a little bit of enough design to be dangerous, And it's kind of similar with coding too, right? Like you have a lot of founders who are maybe not traditionally engineers, but will actually sit down and build stuff, and because they have to. But, there are enough tools to have made that accessible, and, they have enough exposure to be a good judge of talent. So I kind of think of it like there is a convergence of functions to some extent. And, as an example, like Dylan was a design intern at Flipboard, right? And maybe he's not kind of like the traditional archetype of a designer, but like definitely has many of those sensibilities. And so that's kind of how I view the world, where actually it might be an artifact of design having become more accessible, or having permeated everyone's kind of roles more.
What about this sort of idea of commerciality or commercial taste? I don't know, my weekly held perspective is that if you were to take the broad population and designers, they generally underexpress commercial taste. And do you think that has anything to do with it?
I don't know if it's underexpressed, and more that, designers are encouraged to be completely customer centric, right? Like user centric. And so, in a healthy kind of like triad of, design, PM, engineering, for example, like, engineering might be kind of thinking about feasibility, scalability, and, PMs might be thinking about kind of like commercial viability. And designers, are thinking about like what's the best experience for users, even if doesn't seem technically or commercially feasible. And somewhere along the way, like a great product is built with that kind of tension, right? And so that's kind of how I would explain why, you don't necessarily always see that manifest so clearly with the designers, because like that's the point of the function, to be really focused on users to some extent. I do think that like there was a period in time where, I remember when I was at Google, for example, there's this like saying of do what's right by the user and everything else will follow. And when you looked at some of the goals that we had back then, like it was pretty removed from commercial stuff too. But there was this belief that like somewhere along the way that translated. And it's probably true that like some of that changed. People have become more innovative around business models, and like that has created a much more competitive landscape where like, if you don't apply more creativity there, like you get left behind. So it's possible that the sophistication on like the business model front has also made that way more important. Whereas before, you just build products that people love, and like can stick some ads in there and it kind of works as a business kind of thing. And that's like not how it works anymore.
Yeah, you also wonder, did Google do the ecosystem sort of a disservice for so many years? Because again, going back to, each company is kind of like its own civilization with all of the things that kind of have to fit together in the context of what the company is doing, that you can kind of think about new products or building product differently when you have a cash geyser in the form of AdSense. And that's very different than, your business, where at the end of the day, you're trying to build something great, but that someone is willing to part with money for. And I always wonder, when companies get very big and become these vacuums of talent, and then those people leave and join other companies, like what are the tendencies that have been instilled in them? And is it like a net positive for the ecosystem, or is there like a lot of unlearning that has to happen? I think a lot of people that came out of Google, there's probably a bunch of unlearning because the environment was just so unique that allowed you to do all sorts of things that you couldn't do in maybe a more conventional company, or a company that had a different gross margin structure, all sorts of other stuff.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I think that like, those kinds of companies encourage specialization, and that's great. You get a lot of people with amazing talent, but you don't always have the luxury, like, in certain companies you might just have one designer, or, you might need someone who is able to wear multiple hats. And certainly there's a level of unlearning I even had to do coming into a place like Uber, where, as I mentioned earlier, it's like, I remember the experiment that moved the needle the most for a business was like an email that our operations team sent to the users. And it was this funny story where I had come from YouTube and we were kind of trying to figure out how to make Uber Pool work better. And we were trying to get more people to walk to the corners so that the pickups would be smoother, so that everyone, for example, in New York, cars would just go up and down avenues. They don't have to go in and out of streets to kind of pick up riders. So it's we're trying to encourage people to walk. And we were doing that in the app, can you walk, please, et cetera. And then someone in operations just blasted out an email to be like, tomorrow morning at AM, we just need you to walk. And if you do, we'll give you an incentive, and people did it, And so you're like, okay, that's humbling, right? And I have to unlearn this idea that everything can be achieved via software. And so, yeah, I think there's always the case of your environment shapes you. And not to ding Google, I think there's a lot of unlearning you have to do every time you change jobs or change industries.
Going back to the thread we were talking about in going multi-product, when you think about the next separate product you're going to build or the last one, talk more about sort of the team structure and how small the team is. And you talked a little bit about the sort of traits and the type of product people that you like to put on it. But do you cleave the team off now? Is it 3 people? Is it 5 people? Is it 30 people? Is it what does it actually look like now?
I think we always start pretty small and we can do all the reviews that you want, but there's a moment where an idea becomes an idea on paper to something that's actually believable. And, there's nothing better than a working prototype to make something believable. And we have an environment called staging internally where people put something up and that feels like the moment where it feels like, oh, this is actually could be a real product or there's some magic there.
And so is there a lot of things being prototyped in that context before you decide? If you think about slides would be an example of a big new product. Were the stakes very low at the beginning where someone was just prototyping what slides could be like and eventually it crosses some chasm as it's going to be a new product bet?
Slides is the product manager for Mihika was always asking for the green light for the project. And for a long time, we didn't give that green light because we weren't sure. We had just said we were trying to do so many things and we believed in the product, but we weren't sure if it was something we needed to really focus on right now, given everything else that's happening. But, with her small team, she kind of persisted and got it to a point where she got convinced some teams to start using it. And next thing you know, it kind of had proliferated internally. We're like, wait, this is great. People like it. And especially the non-designers in the company who are always forced to use Figma just because, we're Figma. We're like, wait, this is so much better. And so I think there are ways in which, a small prototype or just getting something, an MVP, even internally, just completely changes the game in terms of just seeing that kind of surge of everyone wanting it gives so much more conviction that there's a there.
And so then how does that map to now how you think about new products in the sense of, do you let a bunch of people follow their curiosity and sort of pitch prototypes? Do you get together as a leadership team and say, we want to make one big bet in 2025 or 26? What does it end up looking like?
There's both the completely bottoms up things that happen in forums like Maker Week, where we explicitly create time to do that. And then there's, a portfolio of bets, even as leadership, where we're like, okay, we have 5 or 6 things that we're maybe excited about. Let's put a small team on it and see where that goes. And let's incubate them. And all of them, we actually deeply believe in. And we of course, have the luxury of building products that we ourselves internally use because we also build products. So that's a first milestone we give those teams. And then we can really staff it in a serious way after that.
When you think about those 3 or 5 or 6 sort of things that are coalescing at the leadership level, does that form just based on taste and intuitive judgment? Or is there a structure or a way that you're thinking about those 5 or 6 things that you may want to pursue?
There's a higher level framework, I think, that we have. And I'll share one of them, which is we have a diagram of what we believe to be the end-to-end product development process. And of course, it's messy and it's non-linear, but there are still these distinct things that need to happen for a product to go from idea to reality. And when we look at it, we kind of have an overlay of okay, who are all the people involved and what are they doing and where are the gaps right now? Most specifically, where are customers feeling the pain? And right now, for example, I think the customers are facing most pain where between kind of the translation from the design to the final product, right? And it's a common idea that, you have a beautiful mock and it looks great in theory, but then when it's actually built, like it's off. Like, and it's not the engineer's fault always. It's like, it could be that it was underspecified, anything. But it's like that.
The world is complicated.
Yes, the world is complicated. So that is obviously a huge area that we need to invest in. So we're like, okay, like what are the products that we can build to build that bridge better? So, we kind of have a mapping like that. And so that's both coming from a place of, in many cases, our users and customers asking, like we just go to our buyers and say, what are the biggest problems? Like forget Figma, like what is the biggest problems that you're facing right now? But also kind of conviction around like where we think the world is going in terms of product development or where we see kind of like the industry moving. I think it's a good mix. Well, I would say it's like intuition that is backed by kind of a lot of deeper conversations with our customers.
Why hasn't it not made sense for Figma to make meaningful acquisitions in terms of getting into the next product where you really buy something that's working and start to cross-sell it away, a la Microsoft, Salesforce, so many other companies?
We've over the years brought in a lot of teams, and they've taken more the shape of an acqui-hire, but to really extend what we've built, or in many cases they built kind of very relevant products, but we've taken kind of insights from that and integrated it into our platform. But it doesn't come from a place of philosophically we're against that.
Just haven't found the right thing.
That, and also, for now, we've been building a very integrated product. And so it's a little bit harder to imagine something like completely orthogonal. And that being said, certainly for the right thing, and if it is in service advancing our vision for making products easier to build, then, we're certainly open to it and open to ideas as well.
We'd be delighted to sell you a company. It's always interesting, that sort of difference between creating something out of nothing versus improving something. I think it's like underexplored. And I think it's one of the reasons why there are, like one of the most interesting questions I think in technology is why aren't there more successful companies? Like what's the core binding constraint? Is it the size of end markets? Is it, so many other things? But I think it's somehow this taste, ability, tendency that's required in a human to get something from nothing to something. There's something unique about those people. And I haven't been able to quite pin it down. One of the things that I think a lot about is the topic of commerciality. Like I think it's the most underexplored topic in products. And like, what is the difference between a good product and a good business? And what's the difference between something that someone likes and something that someone will pay for? What will they pay for? Why do they pay that amount? And that's sort of the other sort of limiting constraint, I think, is there's not that many people with incredible design taste or technical ability or what have you that are also very commercial. I think a lot of people think about commerciality and the concept of like selling something, but I think it's so much more than that. It's like being able to feel around a problem and understand the weight of the economic opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I would classify myself more as someone who's been more kind of in the 1 to 10 journey as opposed to the 0 to 1 journey. And, as someone on that side, I come from a worldview maybe that like not everything has to start from scratch. And I come from a worldview where like I'm more optimistic that I can take an existing thing and like evolve it or, radically change it or extend it in really interesting ways. And also kind of getting scale out of the gate to play with is really interesting too. It's not like there's a shortage of interest in that kind of idea of building something, but like, I think different people channel it in different ways.
I also wonder what would happen if designers were forced to do more selling themselves. And I don't know how that works in sort of the context of Figma, but I feel like going back to this question about commerciality and is it over or under expressed in designers, I just wonder as a group, there are a few groups in a company that conventionally are asked less in terms of selling than designers. Like I think a lot of the best 0 to 1 product people should be forced to get the first $1 million in revenue for the thing, not just build the widget and have the sales team bring it to market. And that happens sometimes, I think, in certain companies that think a lot about that topic. But designers, like literally a designer being forced to go sell a product and get a contract from a company just tends to not happen. And I wonder if that's sort of robbing the design community of something with so much goodness comes from getting someone to part with their money.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. I mean, I think it's true of many other functions too, right? Like engineering and others, right?
But a lot of times with engineering, and maybe it's different in the context of Figma, there's sales engineering.
I see.
There's post-sales integration. There's engineering roles that get close to that customer and get close to the transaction, where there's something a little bit more removed, at least in conventional companies. I obviously don't know the details of where design is situated in Figma.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like another theme that it touches on is we do think that, designers are a little bit distanced from production today, right? We have there's a design, it's really well thought out. And then there's a point at which it kind of moves over to the code base and it gets more and more distant, right? And of course, designers are part of the QA process and are really interested in the research and, seeing what's on the field. But there's just large parts of that process that they kind of lose visibility into. And I think that's an interesting problem for us to want to solve, which is that, going back to the biggest problem, I think the biggest problem is that kind of gap between what's designed in their mock and what's actually built. And, the more and more we create tighter connections between them, could a designer be interested in, of course, a designer would be interested in seeing kind of exactly what an end user sees, but today they don't have much visibility into that, right? Or, they would be interested to kind of have better tools to check before something goes out that it looks like exactly the way they want. And there is a tooling gap there, I think, as well as the mentality, but the mentality is kind of informed by the tooling in some way. So I think there is an opportunity there in some things that we think about.
What about something we haven't talked a lot about thus far, which is the role of story around products and new products, and maybe how that ladders into internally the way that you think about storytelling around products, and then how that flows into the story that the customer is ultimately going to be the consumer of.
When I think about kind of internal storytelling, going back to the 0 to 1, I feel like in order for people to really buy into building something from scratch, they really need to be motivated by that story of why does this product have to exist? Why is it better, et cetera? And so, a story is even more important for those kinds of initiatives. But I think the most interesting thing is actually the external storytelling, something I've really learned from at Figma, which is early days of Figma. Honestly, when I first joined, most of our roadmap was just catching up to Sketch, right? And there's a huge list of things that we just had to go after that people thought of as table stakes. And when you go to these conversations with customers, when you end up in a conversation where it's just about features, this is not a place you want to be in, right? Because, technically Sketch has more features, our competitors have more features. And so what we really needed to kind of sell people on was our philosophy and our approach, and really have them bet on our trajectory. Can you squint and believe that in 6 months, 12 months, this is a vastly better tool that's going to dramatically change the way you work? And so that's the kind of storytelling I think that's needed to kind of not have people index on current capabilities. I mean, not to say that you should always be selling ahead, because our sales leader is always against selling ahead in that, from the perspective of selling future features that don't exist. But, having people understand the philosophy of, how you build. Oh, this is a team that really prioritizes being responsive to customers and getting stuff out quickly. That gives me confidence that when I bring things up, it's going to be addressed, or, I see your vision of where you're headed, and that's totally really exciting.
What did that sound like in the early days to try to reset sort of the win conditions for the product?
Part of it was really re-anchoring everyone on, no, this is not about just your design team, it's your entire product team. Because when you think about where our strengths were, it was that cross-team collaborations. For PMs and engineers, it was a dramatically better world. Around the time when I joined, I like to describe Figma as designers reluctantly using it because they recognize the value of collaboration, but they themselves, a single player tool, they felt it was insufficient relative to Sketch. But the value and the strategic value is what we sold there of this is a tool that is going to put design front and center. Right? That you're going to be the hub of the product team. You're going to really excite your engineers and product managers. And those are some of the things that I think were really exciting and felt more connected to the kinds of transformations companies wanted to make. So that's where we index people versus, I also remember conversations where they're well, why can't we use Figma offline? Or, little features here and there. And as soon as they went there, it was just kind of a unproductive conversation, because we didn't have all those things.
So maybe sort of an offshoot of that is also just thinking back to when you joined working on the core product. Again, there's literally thousands of features when you look across Sketch or Photoshop at the time. Every time you talk to customers, they would tell you one of those features or a new feature. The 10-year vision was going to be, we're going to do everything I assume that Photoshop can do practically and better. So how did you choose what you're going to do next month, next quarter, next year?
I don't think there was anything particularly magical about the way we approach prioritization. I mean, we spend a lot of time with our users, people in the community, and, solicited their impact and had a strong intuition around what people were asking about. Like, we could quantify like what people are asking for the most.
In terms of frequency?
Yeah, just in terms of frequency, how much it comes up, whether it's in a sales conversation or just generally in our community. And so I think we had a pretty strong command of that. But, I think there were areas that we were more focused on. So, for example, design systems was that. We had an insight where, our design systems features was actually one of the reasons, people chose Figma, because it created economies of scale and the design functions were maturing, and that kind of the buyer was becoming more kind of centralized in these design operations type kind of like functions. And so it was really clear to us that, that was really important to us. Or, we actually spent a lot of time with the customers at the most sophisticated design teams. So back then that was like a Facebook and Airbnb. They represented the future of design teams, like where design teams might be in 2 or 3 years. So how do we like build for them so that we can get to a point where, everyone can operate in that way. So those are some ways in which we prioritized. But, at the end of the day, like, again, it was a little bit more like, getting to a point where we could convince people, our customers, that we are listening to them. Like, I remember a lot of conversations where I was just really, people would come in with all these asks, right? Like, here's the 10 features that I want. And I would just say, hey, like, we're working on these other features. Like, would you prioritize that over them? And they're like, no, those are more important. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things I think about having customers that are themselves product builders, because they're empathetic to the idea of prioritization and they understand the game.
What are the worst parts of having customers who are also product builders?
Well, I wouldn't say it's worst. I mean, I think there's a double-edged sword where, we have a lot of designers who just design exactly what they want and show us that, and which is like really wonderful in some ways, because it's just like a very strong and evocative articulation of like what they want, right? With no ambiguity whatsoever. And so that's really great. But I think at the same time, it could sometimes mean that they're frustrated if we don't act on that, because they're like, well, it's so obvious. I even drew it for you. And, the reality is that sometimes we have to unpack that a little bit and be like, well, like, you're asking for this, but actually, if you really come to the root of it, is like, we have this problem. Maybe this problem shouldn't exist in the first place. And there's ways in which you can come up with something better, And so, I think like kind of tempering expectations is like, can sometimes be hard as a result of that. But for the most part, yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing.
How often will somebody mock something up for you and it's actually the correct thing that you should build? Is that very atypical, actually?
Yeah, I mean, we often ship things, and in like our replies or in our launch tweet, people would be like, why doesn't it work like this? Or point out mistakes. Cool. And, and we do our best to, credit them and kind of celebrate that, because like that's part of like the community we build. But yes, like very often.
Going back to sort of the note around storytelling around product and product building, what does that look like in the context of a new product? Like when you shipped FigJam or Slides? Like, what is the genesis of the language and overarching story that you're developing, and where in the life of a product do you spend time, or is it more improvisational? Like, how does it ultimately work?
We are very kind of focused on our community, and even internally. And as a result, some of the behaviors, even for Slides and FigJam, it all started with an observation of how our users are using the product in the first place. And for Slides, for example, something like 5% of Figma files are decks before Slides existed, right? And you're probably familiar, you've seen a few pitch decks, I'm sure, before we had a Slides product. And so that already is like a big part of the story, right? Because, a lot of the question is like, when we're building a new thing, is like, will people use it? And, we have proof of that, like there's demand. That's a starting point for sure. And then it's like, okay, but why is it any better than like existing products and et cetera, et cetera? And you kind of get into that from there. But I think that's been unique for us in that we have a pretty general platform where you can do a lot of things. When you look at our community, for example, there are people who do like wedding planning in Figma or interior design or floor plans and stuff like that. And those are not use cases or verticals that we're actively pursuing, but it is indicative of like we have a really creative community trying to stretch our platform in very different ways. And so it usually starts there in terms of like, there's already actually people wanting this and really twisting our product to make it work. And I think those are kind of usually the most powerful insights to motivate the project in the first place.
And so then if you hear someone telling you the story of the product that they're building, or at least maybe with a customer lens, like the narrative they're going to tell the customer, what makes that good? Or if you're like, I think it can be better, like what are the underpinnings of product marketing or storytelling when you're bringing a product in the context of the end customer?
I sometimes have a more superficial way of looking at it, which is what is the one screenshot that is completely self-explanatory? You look at it and you're like, I want that, and maybe it's not a screenshot, maybe it's like a GIF or something, but like if you can kind of distill it down to something so recognizable that, like, yes, like that is awesome. Like, I really want that. Or that's really inspiring. Like, that's for me, like the center of the story. Because I think when we talk about stories, like it sounds like words, but for me, just as important is like that visual that is like super evocative. And maybe, because we're a design company, we think in that way to some extent. But as they say, like an image is worth 1,000 words. And I even think about, again, it's a little superficial, but like, what is the one tweet that we're going to do to like launch this thing where people are like, because in many cases, you have to motivate people to even try in the first place. And, in order to do that, like you need to show something that they want. And so that's a design problem. That's a storytelling problem. But like that distillation, I think is really important.
And is there a set of commonalities that tie together the great screenshot? Or do you just look at a bunch of them and it intuitively makes sense?
Yeah, so this is like an interesting one because often, I push my team a little bit, like in the process of designing and you're adding new features and stuff like that, it's just easy to just add more things. And then you're kind of like, when you see the evolution to get there, you kind of empathize for how we ended up there. But if you don't see the evolution, you're coming fresh at a screenshot with no context. You're like, what is that? And when someone has to explain to be like, okay, let me just unpack this, like what's going on for you. To me, that's an indication of like, well, maybe we haven't made it simple enough, or maybe we haven't kind of like really distilled the value proposition enough. And so for me, like a quality of it is just like the fact that it's self-explanatory and that like it doesn't require like 3 paragraphs of explaining what's going on. Right. And of course, like, not everything can be expressed in this static screenshot, but like, something that can even be, reflected in like a 5-second GIF, like, can be that too. But I think one of the nice things about it, thinking about it this way, is like it forces people to think about simplicity, but it also forces people to think about brand as well. Like the best stories make you feel something, and the big experiences make you feel something. And so like you can get a little bit more, okay, how do you infuse that into?
Is there a screenshot associated with a launch that comes to mind that like just gets at this perfectly, or a tweet that sort of summarizes this idea?
And for dev mode, I remember showing in dev mode how you can have a diff in your designs. And for a developer, that green-red view of like, is like a diff that they see in code all the time. And to be able to see that with designs, with code underneath, that's like really evocative of like, oh, now you're speaking my language. Because that's not how I viewed Figma before. So that's like an example of that. Or, with FigJam, we really leaned into these tools should be fun. Like these tools should allow people to express themselves in ways you can't, because workplace tools are so boring and oppressive. And so we kind of celebrated that kind of like quirky fun when we were promoting FigJam. And I think that was kind of evocative in its own way.
What do you think is the difference between a very good product manager and an extraordinary one?
I think it's this very topic of storytelling, because what we just described in terms of like that screenshot, to some extent, you can repeat that exercise for a lot of other parts of your product in terms of like, that is like taste, right? Like, what will people like authentically get excited by, and like having a feel for that. There are a lot of like stories for which you have to be like, well, let me tell you, and you trust me. And, you have to have all these caveats. And when something can speak for itself, and you knowing what that looks like, and that kind of permeating every aspect of your product, I also think that like products only get complex over time. And the best product managers are able to add more power while maintaining like that feeling of simplicity. And that's the same idea with the screenshot test too, of like, you look at it and you can quickly parse what's going on. And, products often degrade into like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. And so therefore I need these tooltips to point out to me what I should focus on, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard to hold a mental model of like all of it. And I think, the best product managers can push for that as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because it feels like so many new products, the starting point is simplicity, because they're competing against a product that is extraordinarily complex. But then if you followed that company over the course of a 10 or 15 year journey, they end
It gets
up
more complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
every single time.
Every single time. So it's something that we think about a lot. And in fact, in this past config, which is our user conference, Dylan actually shared this tweet that people tweeted at him last year, which is like, Figma's getting hard. Next year config should be Figma unshipping features, And I think that really hit us hard of like, oh, wow, we are at a point where like we've added quite a lot here, and we're proud of all the capabilities we've added. But as a new user who didn't grow up with Figma, so to speak, it can be intimidating. And so, we did this big redesign to try to simplify the experience. And there's a lot of other projects underway to try to figure out, how we get inventive around solving that.
Why is that important?
Well, I think there's two things. The first is like these swaths of new users who might have a way more narrow use case are definitively going to choose the tool that allows them to do that use case.
Right, and that's, I think, the whole Canvas story in the early days.
Right.
Like if you're a mom and dad and you're creating an invite for your birthday party, you're not going to go in Photoshop. And so inherently a new opportunity was created for something like that.
Right. New opportunity, but perhaps a lost opportunity, right? And so for us, like when we think about the new wave of designers and creators and new generation of designers, like that's really important for us. We have a big EDU investment right now. And like I was recently watching third graders in Japan use FigJam. It was really fun and cute to watch them do social studies in FigJam. But, I'm realizing, like there's some things that are complicated even about this tool. And, and so these are the people who are going to grow up on them and like, be the next generation. So I think there's that from like purely from like the perspective of where your new user is coming from, right? Because again, like they didn't grow up with the tool and therefore didn't see the evolution. And then the other thing is like, I actually think that the simplicity shouldn't be equated with fewer features. I think that like, it's really about mental models. Like when you look at a really complicated product, you're like, well, I'm trying to do this thing. I know it's somewhere, but I have no idea how to get there, right? And you go to a help document or you're searching around, like that sucks, right? And, you could be in a world where like, if your app is organized in a way where you can know where to expect something, like that's a much better place to be. And that doesn't equate to everything is always present, right? If some things are, organized well, then it's in a good place. And it may be possible that like with AI, for example, things could change, right? Because AI bypasses a lot of like navigation and complexity. And so we might see kind of like a different set of incentives emerging or kind of tools evolving separately, or, tools not feeling the pressure to kind of keep adding to their interfaces and rather just expose these capabilities to kind of like an AI or like so that'll be interesting to see.
It's definitely going to be fascinating to see if generally power and complexity go hand in hand, and if that paradigm starts to change with what's happening with LLMs. ChatGPT is probably a good example of like an infinitely powerful product that in so many ways is infinitely simple, that breaks sort of that normal complexity power sort of paradigm. One thing I just wanted to go back to in our last couple of minutes that you talked a little bit about when we're talking about the difference between a very good PM and an extraordinary PM is like this idea of taste. Some of it's taste around the narrative, some of it's taste around sort of power and simplicity. What else can you say about taste as it relates to product and design?
The first thing is like in a corporate environment, you can kind of logic your way into a lot of choices. And it can sometimes be hard to fight that because so much of the incentive is making progress, making decisions. And so someone who's willing to slow something down and say, no, like we don't have a solution here, right? Like so many kind of like reviews that you end up being, you're like choice A or choice B, here are these trade-offs, like which one do we go with? Let's make a decision. And success is seen as making progress and getting something out there and learning from that. But I think like someone who's willing to put their foot down and say, no, this isn't compelling. This isn't good enough. We could do better. And in order to say that, of course, it's not just taste, it's like conviction. And there's a certain kind of like way you have to exert yourself, and so there are those soft skills too. But part of it is like the imagination that something could be better, right? And so like those are the people who I want to surround myself with, or, I want leading product teams, because usually the incentive isn't there.
Do you think on that note that it tends to be quite learnable, or just some random set of ingredients that get injected into someone?
Yeah, hard to say. There's some amount of like organizational calibration that's necessary, right? Which is like, what is our bar for craft here, and learning that, because depending on the environment, you might have like changed your bar because there are other incentives at play, right? Like a culture that, for example, is very experiment heavy and, like metrics driven, et cetera, might kind of force you to kind of optimize in a different way. And you have to like unlearn that. And there's been these calibration moments we've had to have internally too. But to me, like, I don't know about the philosophical question of whether it's nurture or nature, but like, I do think it's a combination of like a lot of exposure to good and bad things. And like, if you've been exposed to great products or great, designers, like you tend to know that you can hold out for something better, for example, right? But yeah, there's probably some innate aspects to it too.
It reminds me of sort of filmmaking. If you listen to a lot of the best filmmakers, they're obsessive consumers of movies forever, every genre, every type of movie. And yet when you go look at their work, it's not like they're taking Tarantino or Wes Anderson and just jamming it into their storytelling. But that sort of consumption, sort of your point about seeing and studying products, I think is a big part of what generates their own taste.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is some amount of like, it comes back to the kind of irrationality, but like irrational obsession, right? Like sometimes like I stay up all night to like make a perfect deck for all hands or something, but it's just because I care. And, like I know that like that extra effort might mean that something is that much more memorable, or, and so like that willingness to do that is also part of this, because part of like not settling is knowing that there's something better, but also willing to do the work to like find the thing that is better.
Yeah, that goes back to Jobs with the back of the Mac, or there was something, or the inside where nobody would ever see it, but it had to be meticulously designed, right, kind of way of thinking.
Yeah. And so I think there's just kind of this like craftsmanship, and maybe it might be true that I'm like over idealizing it, because like it's just so like deep in my own values to some extent for whatever reason. But yeah, I really look for that.
I wanted to wrap up where we often do, which is when you think about in the context of your work and building great products, who's the person that's like most shaped your worldview on that? And is there something they lodged in your brain that's sort of a big part of the way that now you approach building products that maybe we didn't talk about, or you could kind of expand on a little bit?
What's coming to mind is actually my high school English teacher, Georgina MacArthur. What she taught was kind of literary commentary, like reading something and, making a case for like what it's about and finding the evidence for it. And I think like part of why it is connected to me with product building is like, it actually comes back to a little bit of this storytelling of like, you're picking up on these little insights here and there, and you're trying to synthesize it into something cohesive. And, you can kind of look at a thesis and like be like, that's like a BS thesis, right? Like you just took up these things and you're just saying something. And then at other times, like you've really synthesized it well into something like, oh yeah, there's something here. And like that difference is something that she taught me. And the act of kind of taking these little insights and laddering it up into something more meaningful. It's like, well, why does this alliteration matter here, or this or whatever, is kind of an approach I take to product building to some extent, because like, users are telling you things in really subtle ways about what's working, what's not. And sometimes the data insights, sometimes it's like something you personally observe or have felt. And like taking those little bits and like deriving like the thesis of what we need to build and why is like so much of product building. So yeah, a little bit of a out there answer, but that's the first person who came to mind.
Nice. Great place to end. Thank you so much for spending the time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.